There are many ways that you could describe the Dune franchise. A fun, exciting sci fi epic set thousands of years in the future. Interesting characters, cool, nice looking places, and some extremely interesting concepts. But above all else, Dune by Frank Herbert is a mind provoking story, a critique of humankind that tackles bigger ideas and questions, such as religion, power, what power can lead to, and the future of men as a whole. It truly is a one in a generation story that rivals the likes of The Lord of the Rings and Star Wars in terms of its imagination and brilliant storytelling, and is in my mind, and probably the minds of many others, the greatest science fiction story ever told. And with Dune Part 2 recently releasing in cinemas, the second movie and Denis Villeneuve's adaptation of Herbert's novel, what better time to dive head and shoulders first into the world of Dune and the deeper messages that Herbert is trying to get across to us. Religion through the Fremen and the idea of the lisanal gabe, corruption of those in power through the portrayals of the Emperor Shaddam Corrino IV, and the critique of humans through the greed and want for revenge shown not just through the villains, but through the protagonists as well, with Paul being, of course, an unconventional anti-hero. And following the 3 points that we've mentioned, this analysis will be split into 2 parts: religion and power and corruption. And seeing as the last 2 points are pretty similar, we'll mostly just link them into each other in one big analysis. Also, just to keep in mind, this analysis will draw points mainly from the books, but there may be occasional references to the movies. But with that said, let's dive into the philosophy of Dune. Let's start then with religion, which will probably be one of the smaller talking points in this video. So, religion in Dune. Well, right off the bat, Dune is all about religion, because undoubtedly for me, the biggest and most important point of focus throughout the story is religion. It is the basis and reason that the entire story takes place. It's the reason that Paul becomes emperor, the reason the Fremen stand so faithfully and blindly by his side, and the reason that these books can be read, understood, and loved by so many different people. And Dune is based off loads of different religions, but a few in particular stand out. The main political leaders of Dune all adhere to an unnamed religion whose holy book is called the Orange Catholic Bible. It is made clear throughout Dune that at some point in the past, all the major religions of Earth united into one. What's also interesting about this point is that characters like Paul, Jessica, and pretty much all the Fremen don't follow one particular religion. Not a single character really does. But rather, it seems that all religions have become one, and all characters understand and for some part follow this religion. Because this one religion consists of many different ideas taken from many different faiths and put together into one. And one thing that this can be interpreted as is that Dune is not a conflict between people of opposing religions or gods, but rather it is the conflict that occurs firstly with political leaders, ideologists who threaten religion not just in the Dune universe, but ours as well. This point is something that we'll look into a bit more detail later though. And the second reason is that the religious conflict occurs, as we see quite noticeably in the Dune 2 movie actually, is when these religious people and factions are no longer worshipping someone or something because of their love or fear of them, but rather through complete blind faith, which is quite relevant when studying the role of the Fremen in the larger narrative. But now let's look at the main religions that are in Dune, or other elements of these religions which are very clearly part of this overall faith that we discussed before. Firstly, Buddhism, which, while it plays an extremely small part in the story, is undeniably present. Then we have Christianity, which has, as mentioned before, the Orange Catholic Bible, clearly drawn from the Bible in Christianity. And if you want to go really deep, there could even be an argument that Paul is a representation, or rather an allegory for Jesus himself. Though Paul being the Messiah, which itself is drawn from the Jewish belief of an eventual Messiah coming as their savior, which is again pretty akin to what the Fremen believe Paul is, and you can already see the similarities coming in. And the similarities, they don't stop there. Leto II, the son of Paul in the later novels, also has huge links to religious figures. For example, his priests call him Satan, essentially an embodiment of evil. And finally, perhaps the most significant religion in the universe of Dune is Islam, which is extremely relevant throughout. Paul Jihad at the end of the series is a concept from Islam. The Fremen people, their culture and ways of living are extremely resemblant of Islamic beliefs and culture. The Lisan al-Gaib, taken from Arabic, and there are so many other clear-cut examples of Islam being the main religion in Dune. But what overall is religion in Dune all about? What is Frank Herbert trying to tell us through his portrayal of Leto II, Paul, the Bene Gesserit? What is it all about? And what is the main underlying message? Well, that is the power that religion can have on people, and how it is not just a force for good or of true faith, but sometimes something much more sinister and manipulative from those in power, especially when it's mixed in with politics. One big example of this is the Bene Gesserit, a political and seemingly religious order that uses religion to manipulate people and get what they need. They use faith to their advantage to create the Kwisatz Haderach, and there's a certain irony in this that the role of a religious authority is so important with its absolute claims on belief and action, despite the fact that the people behind this, the most powerful in charge, actually lack any true belief themselves. And this theme of religious authorities in charge being a bad thing continues throughout, as we are offered a very clear warning against over reliance on leaders and on religious authorities. And this theme can in some way be shown as a similarity and comparison for our world. For this, Paul is our main point of focus now. Being because Paul across his arc in the novels eventually becomes essentially a dictator. He essentially becomes a leader over the human race who brings oppression, death, and slaughter, and is for the most part followed completely blindly by his followers, something that we'll discuss in much more detail in the next part of this analysis. So the way that this compares to our world is in the way that leaders have been given vast amounts of power. Often these leaders exploit it, using their position, power, and reach to benefit themselves through accumulating wealth and power. While this is definitely not every leader or every person in charge, it is still relevant and occurs too often, and it is portrayed to us through characters like Paul. Overall, though, this implies that people must not accept views or leaders, political, religious, or both, without thinking the views through for themselves. But the conversation doesn't finish there, and there are so many other things to talk about in terms of religion in Dune. But overall, the one overarching message for me is the power that religion can have over people who have blind faith, and how it can be a way of manipulation and control by those in charge. However, it's not all bad because Herbert also acknowledges the positive side of religion and how it can be a force for good. Because we have to remember that again, not all religion in Dune is bad. For example, Leto II, the God Emperor, draws upon elements of various faiths to create a new religion or religious order known as the Golden Path, which is the only way forward for humanity to save them. Leto's vision of a unified religion reflects Herbert's broader commentary on the potential for religion to serve as a unifying force in society, transcending what you might say cultural and ideological divides, and how religion is undoubtedly positive, but how people in charge use it to their advantage, and that is how it becomes a negative force. So, to finish off this segment of our analysis, I'm going to mention one final quote from Frank Herbert pertaining to everything that we have discussed so far. When religion and politics travel in the same cart, the rider believe that nothing can stand in their way. Well, to start off this segment, it's probably best to share right off the bat one of Frank Herbert's most famous quotes when looking at the portrayal of characters like Paul and Leto II in Dune. I wrote the Dune series because I had this idea that charismatic leaders ought to come with a warning label on their forehead. May be dangerous to your health. And this right here specifically tells us exactly what his purpose was in writing Dune. Expanding on this, another one of Herbert's beliefs was that people in charge should not be trusted or followed with blind faith without thinking. Another quote from Herbert is, "The bottom line of the Dune trilogy is beware of heroes. Much better to rely on your own judgment and your own mistakes." Again, this theme continues on from the first analysis about religion in Dune, where it's the leaders, the people in charge that we should be wary of. And because of this, it's clear that these characters in Dune, the ones in charge, are supposed to be the evil ones. And yes, that includes Duke Leto, Paul, Jessica, the God Emperor, Vladimir Harkonnen. All of these characters are portrayed, or rather are supposed to be portrayed and interpreted as evil, even though they may mean well and think that they are doing the right thing and are the noble people. And I personally think that even Leto and Jessica are meant to be seen as bad by Herbert. Leto is a bad person in a way, as he almost supports and works with evil institutions like the Empire, even though he thinks that he is supporting a noble cause. Jessica, again, while she thinks that she is a good person doing the right thing, ultimately she is not, as she works with and for the Bene Gesserit, an institution that is for the most part evil. And again, while I don't think that she is inherently evil, her actions and her choices end up meaning that she does a lot of harm, or at least more so than good. But she can also be seen as a bad mother across the series, not to Paul but to Alia in her abandonment of her, even when Alia needed her most in Children of June. And whilst Leto and Jessica may have been bad characters in their decisions, this does not make them bad people when compared to, for example, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. The Baron embodies a darker interpretation of leadership, characterized by cruelty, manipulation, and self-interest. His ruthless pursuit of power just knows no bounds, as he schemes and plots to maintain his dominance over Arrakis and its spice resources. And his actions for us serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrupting influence of power. And it's even more interesting when compared to characters like Leto, because despite his noble intentions, Leto's acceptance of the Iraqi stewardship exposes him and his family to danger, and it ultimately costs him his life. This tragic outcome can be interpreted to be a purposeful cautionary tale from Herbert, reminding us of the precarious nature of leadership and the unpredictable consequences of one's decisions, especially when dealing with characters in power, like the Emperor Shaddam Corino. And continuing on, Leto's character exemplifies the complexities of leadership. He's faced with difficult choices that test his integrity and his resolve, forcing him to confront the harsh realities of power and authority. And through Leto's story, Herbert shows that leadership is a tricky balance between doing what's right, being practical, and doing what is necessary to survive and making sacrifices. But now let's turn to perhaps the most important and relevant part of this analysis, Paul. Now, before we continue on with Paul, let's turn our attentions quickly back to that quote from the beginning of this segment about charismatic leaders. I wrote the June series because I had this idea that charismatic leaders ought to come with a warning label on their forehead, maybe dangerous to your health. And the reason why I wanted to mention this is because I don't necessarily think that this is saying that all charismatic leaders are bad, dangerous, and will kill you. That's not the case. Rather, that we should be wary and not follow them with absolute blind faith. The reason that I bring this up now is because while yes, some of this quote pertains to Paul and can be interpreted to be taught to be part of the philosophy of Paul's character, it is most definitely not the main focal point of his arc. And I believe that we see themes like the complexities of leadership, the consequences of power, and the pursuit of destiny through Paul more so than him being a charismatic leader. And whilst I've already mentioned how Paul is an unconventional protagonist in the way that he's not a good person at all, there is another thing that makes Paul's character truly unique, and that is how tragic his story is. And this is mainly caused by his prescience, his ability to see into the future and know things before they happen. Well, when you first hear this, it may seem like a really amazing ability to have. In reality, it almost destroys Paul. Because he essentially becomes a slave to time, a term which I really like, which I've heard in multiple essays on this topic. When you have prescience, it changes your views going forward on pretty much everything, because these futures that you see are not 100% guaranteed, and it is the cause for many of Paul's decisions going forward, and are not very good ones. Like, for example, going into the desert with the Fremen instead of fleeing the planet with his mother at the end of the original Dune book. Further on, Paul sees the jihad in some of his earliest prescient visions and struggles to find a way forward that will not ignite the conflict throughout the universe. And eventually, it leads to post jihad, the death of 61 billion people across the universe, which, despite being an extremely high amount of death, was still one of the best outcomes for mankind. And another one of the central messages of Paul's character is the notion that with power comes great responsibility and often exacts a heavy toll on those who wield it. Despite his initial intentions to use his authority for the greater good, Paul finds himself increasingly consumed by the trappings of power and leads to the fate that we all know. And adding to the argument of Paul being a tragic character, one of the most interesting things about him is that Paul didn't necessarily ask for anything that happened to him. He didn't originally want to be the Messiah, the Kwisatz Haderach. He didn't want to be the Fremen's prophet, their god, their Lisan al-Gaib. Something that I think is very well portrayed in the movies and definitely does justice to the book. Paul is placed in his position with this power because of the Bene Gesserit's scheming plans, because of his mother and her want for a son. Everything was put into place before Paul was born, and his terrible purpose was in place again before he was even born. And that is the tragedy of his character. Also, one last point before we end off this segment, and it's just to acknowledge that a common theory or interpretation that goes around the Dune fandom that Paul is a representation or embodiment of Jesus by Herbert. Whilst I'm not fully against this idea, I don't believe that it's true, but there is, in my opinion, still something to this theory. So then, that ends off our assessment of Paul Atreides and of Dune. And after exploring everything that we have explored so far, what, in a nutshell, is the philosophy of Dune? Well, firstly, the first one, religion. Whilst Dune is not fully negative to religion or against it in any way, there are definitely some key downsides that Herbert emphasizes a lot. Firstly, how religion, when combined with politics, can be an extremely powerful and useful tool. And secondly, how those in charge can use religion as a tool, almost as mind control, to preach their own ideals and gain power over people, despite the fact that they themselves don't have any faith. Also, the themes of Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, and above all Islam in Dune are very interesting to look at and ponder over, and I think Herbert absolutely nailed that aspect of the story. Now we have another one of Herbert's key themes, leaders and power. One message that comes across a lot is how Herbert didn't really believe or like the government, or generally the authorities in charge for that matter. And it's definitely apparent in his writing in the way he approaches portraying the authorities in the Dune universe. And one last crucial factor to always remember with the Dune world, universe, story, books, movie, whatever form of media it may be for Dune, and that is that the Dune story is not a normal story. It is not a classic tale of good versus bad where the good guys win and everyone lives happily ever after. is not like a popular movie or book franchises like Star Wars, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings. And the reason for this is because Dune is a criticism of humanity, of people, our nature, and our actions. In my opinion, not a single character in Dune is actually truly good. Everyone is in some way, shape, or form evil or has something imperfect about them. Paul, our protagonist, is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. His parents, Duke, Leto, and Jessica, whilst they may believe that what they do is for a noble cause and that they are righteous people, are not, as they both serve evil institutions that are evil. The God Emperor is completely evil. The houses can be interpreted as evil. The Bene Gesserit are evil. Paul's son Leto II is completely evil. Alia, Paul's sister, is definitely not a truly good character either. And so, for all of these reasons put together, in my opinion, Dune is first and foremost a critique of humankind and the often corrupt authorities who lead us. And that, dear viewer, is the philosophy of Dune. But that's just my thoughts on it. What do you think? What is Dune truly about and what is it trying to tell us? Make sure to comment down your opinions down below and feel free to comment on anything that I said in this video that you agree or may disagree with. And also, would you like a part 2? Make sure to comment that as well, where we could focus on other parts of the story like the ecology and the environment and different parts of the philosophy. But that is the end of today's video. Make sure to comment what you think and make sure to subscribe to join the dark side. But that's all. Darth Sauron out.